Montana, early 2010s. Winter shrouds the small town in a cold, opaque haze, like Evan Brooks's life. A thin man in his 30s with hollow eyes and a blank stare. He lives alone in an old trailer that sits quietly in the middle of a field on the outskirts of Livingston. No one visits. No one calls. To the people here, Evan is a shadow, a survivor of war, but slowly dying inside. A former Marine, Evan served 2 tours in Iraq and 1 in Afghanistan. He returned to the United States with no medals or honors, just a haunted suitcase and a broken soul. He brought back sleepless nights, the echoes of gunfire, and images of his comrades falling beside him. When the war ended, his war had only just begun. His marriage to Emily, the wife he once loved dearly, could not bear the weight of invisible wounds. Evan became silent, cold, startled in the middle of the night, sometimes angry for no reason. He could not explain to her the feeling of emptiness and loss when he woke up every morning and did not know what he was living for. Emily tried, waited, cried her eyes out. But in the end, she left, taking with her the little daughter that Evan was no longer mentally stable enough to care for. Since then, Evan has retreated deeper into his own darkness. He has cut off contact with his family and old friends, even refusing any offers of help from veteran organizations. Day after day, he wanders around town in a knit cap pulled low and a worn-out army jacket. His meals are cheap instant noodles, and his only companion is a radio playing old news bulletins. Evan lives, but not as a whole person, but as the remains of a man who sacrificed everything for his country and lost himself in the process. Winter nights in Montana are often bitterly cold, but nothing is as cold as the memories Evan carries in his heart. Often, sitting alone in the quiet of his trailer, he lets the memories flood back, unstoppable. The images do not fade with time. On the contrary, they become more vivid and sharp, as if the war had never ended. Fallujah, the name still chokes Evan. He remembers vividly the night his patrol stumbled into an ambush in a narrow alley, filled with dust and blood. Taylor, his best friend, the one with whom he had shared cigarettes and dreams of life after the war, was shot and fell just a few feet ahead. Evan couldn't save him. In a panic, he ordered artillery fire on a suspicious building, which turned out to be an entire civilian family sheltering. 6 people died, 3 of them children. After the battle, Evan was sent back to base and then discharged shortly thereafter. Back home, he thought he would live in peace. But peace did not come. He could not sleep, could not eat, could not bear the sound of holiday fireworks without shivering as if he were being shot. His family did not understand. They saw only a distant, unapproachable, and silent Evan. Old friends gradually withdrew. Every conversation ended in silence or awkward pleasantries. Emily, the wife who had patiently waited for him to return, was finally exhausted. She tried to ask, tried to love, but Evan could not open his heart. He did not want to talk about what he had done, what he had seen, because he himself did not dare to face it. Unreasonable anger, prolonged depression, and nights of screaming made the shared house gradually become a second battlefield. The marriage broke down, not because of a lack of love, but because there was a huge abyss between them, where Evan had fallen long ago and did not know how to climb out. War doesn't just kill people on the battlefield. It kills the faith, the memories, and the humanity inside a survivor. And Evan, though still breathing, is just a shell left in the whirlwind called war. After years of war and family breakdown, Evan Brooks's life was no longer a flow. It was a free fall into darkness. Day and night were no longer distinct. At night, the small trailer became a place of mental torture. Nightmares came with regularity, as if the past were screaming at him to pay. Evan would wake up in the middle of the night, sweating as if he'd swum through fire, his heart pounding, his eyes staring at the ceiling as if waiting for a gunshot. One night, he screamed so loudly that the neighbors called the police. But then everything fell silent, as if no one knew what to do with a soldier who was no longer on the battlefield. He drank to sleep, to forget, to stop thinking. When the alcohol stopped working, Evan turned to sleeping pills, the ones his doctor had prescribed when he complained of insomnia due to trauma. But the pills were only a temporary fix. His body began to become numb to all kinds of help, leaving him with a tired mind and a haggard body. His face became gaunt, his hair uncut, his beard scraggly. He stopped caring about meals, stopped showering regularly, and subsisted on instant noodles and expired canned goods. Evan tried. He tried at the gas station, the local supermarket, even as a night guard. But his military record and unstable appearance made people wary. He was once hired as a janitor at a school, but quit after 2 weeks, panicked when he heard students knocking over desks. He felt like a burden, not just to society, but to himself. A social worker approached him and suggested he join a veteran support group. Evan reluctantly agreed and attended a few sessions. But he hated talking, hated listening to other people talk about their pain. It was like a mirror image of himself. After the 3rd session, Evan didn't go back. He hated feeling analyzed, questioned, as if he could be taken apart and put back together to be normal. But Evan knew he had strayed too far from normal, and now he was just drifting, aimless, directionless, like a lost soul in a cold land with no way back. The small town in Montana rarely had strangers. But one afternoon in March, as the snow began to melt, Evan happened upon Clara Jennings in the coffee shop near the public library, a place he often went to read old newspapers and escape the cold. The young teacher had just moved up from the South, bringing with her a gentle voice, bright eyes, and a sunny wool scarf. Evan had no intention of starting a conversation. He just sat at his usual table, quietly stirring his cold coffee, his tired eyes looking out the window. But Clara was different. She approached him, asked to borrow the chair next to him, then smiled and asked if he took pictures, because he had an old camera around his neck, an unconscious habit he had long since developed. He was about to nod, but something in her eyes stopped him. No pity, no curiosity, just a gentle, uninviting presence. So they began to talk, hesitantly and slowly, like two people feeling their way through the fog. Clara didn't ask about the war. She didn't press for the past. Instead, she told stories about the children she taught, the innocent stories that made her laugh every day. She invited Evan to a school trip, a class where students would learn about photography from someone with a special eye for light. Evan was about to decline, as usual. But when Clara asked a second time, with a smile that wasn't forced, he accepted. The first day of teaching was so nerve-wracking that he couldn't sleep all night. But as the kids enjoyed the old camera and listened to him talk about sunset light, Evan felt something inside him shift ever so slightly, like a tiny piece of ice melting. From then on, Clara would stop by his house often, bringing pies, books, and stories. She didn't correct Evan. She just stayed there, patient and sincere. That's what made him start writing, not to tell, but to confront. Evan opened an old leather notebook and began jotting down the memories he'd wanted to bury. Not to forget, but to remember properly. In the long darkness of his life, Clara did not bring a bright light, but she was a small ray of light, enough to lead him to take the first steps out of the abyss. Things seemed to be getting better. Evan began to have days without drinking, afternoons spent wandering around photographing the wheat fields that were coming back to life after the winter. He and Clara kept a light relationship, close enough to understand each other, but not forced. Sometimes she left a few books about the war on the kitchen table, not to read, but to let Evan know she wasn't afraid of that part of his past. But then, one day in late May, Evan got a call from an unfamiliar number. It was Ben's ex-wife, his best friend from Afghanistan. Her voice was shaky. Ben is dead, in rehab in Ohio. They said he went into cardiac arrest. Evan couldn't hear the rest. The world around him disappeared, leaving only the ringing in his ears and the image of Ben, his face covered in dust, grinning in his torn armor. That night, Evan drove without knowing where he was going. It was raining, the raindrops pounding against the windshield like bullets. As he turned the corner on the road leading to the old lake, a truck came barreling toward him from the other side. Evan swerved, skidding sideways, spinning before coming to a stop at the edge of the cliff. In that moment, the screams, the explosions, the blood and rubble from the old battlefield flooded back into his mind, loud and vivid. He cowered, holding his head, and then he cried. Not a sob held back in the throat, but a wild, painful sob, as if all the years of fear, all the loss, all the guilt had burst forth in the rain. The next morning, Evan went to the town's veteran support group. He went in, for the first time, not out of compulsion, but because he knew he couldn't go on living the way he had. He talked, listened, and confronted, one by one, the memories that had tormented him in silence. Day by day, he cut back on his drinking. He meditated. He kept a journal. Encouraged by Clara and his therapy team, Evan began taking pictures of himself, his gaunt face, his tired eyes, and saw the changes he was making. Clara was still there for him, not as a lover, but as a steadfast soul. They spent afternoons sitting together, saying nothing, just listening to the wind in the trees. And in those quiet moments, Evan knew he was no longer running away. He was living, for the first time, truly living. A year after that fateful rainy night by the lake, Evan sat in a small room behind the town library, quietly turning the pages of the first edition of his memoir, The Remaining Pieces. The book was not a story of triumph or flashy bravery. It was the journey of a soldier torn from himself and forced to put the pieces back together, with trembling hands, scarred memories, and a heart that had once seemed dead. The book was published by a small press run by a veteran. It didn't make the bestseller list, and there were no big signings. But on veteran forums, people shared it as an honest, painful, and compassionate confession. I finished reading it and cried, wrote one Marine who served in Fallujah. Finally, someone said what I couldn't say. Such responses were few and far between, but to Evan, they were more precious than any medal. He continued teaching photography at school, but then the town asked him to do more, to start a small class for juveniles who had broken the law, helping them rediscover how to see the world through a lens. Evan hesitated at first, but then accepted. During each class, as the tattooed boy smiled sheepishly at his first shot of a sunbeam reflecting on a lake, Evan felt himself come alive, not as a teacher, but as someone who had once been lost and now knew how to lead others out of that rut. Clara was still there for him, nameless, a companion, a support. They sometimes went on long trips together, not to escape, but to open themselves up to new horizons. In the mornings, when the early light filtered through the window, Evan would take out his camera and capture those peaceful moments, with eyes that had stopped shaking. Evan understood that not all wounds heal. Some stay forever, like scars on the skin or scars in the mind. But people can learn to live with them, not deny them, not erase them, but accept them and move on. War, he had thought, ended with the last shot. But now, he knew, it only truly ended when the soldier found peace in his soul. And for Evan, that war was finally over.